just to reiterate some of the things, if you are in crisis now, or you would like to receive emergency help, refer to any of those resources that were provided in the chat in those first few slides. You can call 911, go to a local emergency room, call the National Suicide Lifeline or crisis text line. There are many options out there, which is really wonderful. And I do want to emphasize that at Dragonfly Mental Health, we are not a healthcare provider organization. The information that I'll be providing you with today does not qualify as medical advice and does not substitute for speaking to a medical professional. So what we're going to do today, though, is first I'll give a little bit of a brief personal and then overview of Dragonfly Mental Health introduction. And then the bulk of what we're talking about today is the basics of burnout, and then discuss a little bit more, teasing apart the differences between burnout, depression, and anxiety. So the bulk of what we're hoping to be able to do today, though, is answer your questions. So this is a starter guide. This is just the basics. We want to give you enough information to then start asking your own questions. Where are you at, and how can we help you? So I am a mental health informatics specialist. Not everyone in Dragonfly is, but I've been studying and training for almost 20 years now in the sciences, the research sciences. I started at University of Arizona in psychology and biochemistry. I was in a biochemistry research lab for 4 years there. And then I went to UC Berkeley for my PhD in molecular and cell biology. After finishing there in 2015, went on to a joint postdoc working at Geisinger Health System and Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and trained in psychiatric epidemiology. So my research is on both all the way from molecules to the masses, looking at mental health and especially depression. The work that I've also done in advocacy for academic mental health has also had a long period for me now. So in 2013, I was involved in starting a By Students for Students organization focused on mental health at UC Berkeley in the MCB department. And then I again at Johns Hopkins helped form a school-wide, in the School of Public Health, By Students for Students organization. And finally in 2019, banded together with some wonderful co-founders from all over the world to create Dragonfly Mental Health. So what is Dragonfly Mental Health? We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to cultivating excellent mental health among academics worldwide. And we do this in 3 ways. We have a global consortium for academic mental health. This is a group of over 200 volunteers that are involved in conducting research and trying to address the systemic issues that face academics and their mental health. We build community. So we host 3 times a week a Dragonfly Cafe. It's free to all academics, and it is a peer support area, a great way to get to know us at Dragonfly and what we're up to, as well as support, get support for yourself, sharing your victories and in your struggles with other academics who understand where you're coming from. And then finally, what we're doing today is part of our on-campus program. So we're aiming to create cultural and climate changes directly within academic communities by addressing things with evidence-based approaches. So who we are is over 200 volunteers from over 30 different countries around the world. We have a diverse and wonderful board of directors who's helping us accelerate our growth and our reach around the world. And what we do is we, within 5 particular domains of excellence, focused on people through stakeholder buy-in within institutions, departmental committees, supporting the development of peer networks, and then 3 core elements: building skills, fighting stigma, and addressing mental health literacy and improving that. So that's what this program today is. So when we're talking about mental health or mental illness, we always at Dragonfly like to make sure that we can think about this holistically, and the fact that there is a spectrum and you can be anywhere on this spectrum and you can move around throughout this spectrum quite a bit. So mentally healthy really is where we'd like to be, right? So it's a place where you can bounce back from the daily stresses that pop up. There's really no problem. There's a lot of resiliency there. That's like peak athletes have peak physical health. We would love to have peak mental health. Stress, though, is something that always happens. You cannot avoid it unless, I don't know your secret. If you can't avoid all stresses, please let me know. I would love to know how to do that. But these are things that come up, either planned or unplanned stress, a presentation that's coming up, or something like your child getting sick, and having to respond to and deal with those situations. But this is a state on the mental health spectrum that you can bounce back to the mentally healthy state pretty easily and with very little intervention. Distress is another level of stress. It's something where, it might be a particularly hard stress or long-standing stress that results in you reaching a distressed state. So this is below clinically definable disease, but it is a state that might benefit from some interventions, a little more effort, and or maybe some professional help in order to build tools and change your patterns in order to deal with that distressed state and get back to the mentally healthy state. Mental disease is where many of you may have heard of the DSM 4 or 5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses. And so if you meet criteria for one of those, you've reached a disease state. And then crisis is a state where it is so severe or emergent that an immediate and thorough reaction is required. So the burnout really is kind of in between this distress state and a disease state. And I'm going to explain why in a couple of slides. But first, I want to talk about the research setting. So postgraduate education, which many of you have gone through or are going through yourselves right now, is unique. And so it turns out that most university wellness programs don't target graduate students or postdoc fellows or faculty. And all of those folks are part of academia and have unique needs. And the solutions that are readily available to them made by universities tend to be focused on those undergrads, and they may not work as well. Let me go back. So then, as you probably all know, there are cultural and systemic barriers that make graduate students, researchers, postdocs, and faculty a lot less likely to seek support. We now have research and evidence that confirms this, that folks in academia are 6 to 8 times higher rates of depression and anxiety, but are much less likely than the general population to seek out support for that. And they're more likely to wait longer too. And then postgraduate education and then the faculty positions or the research positions that come after it really come with unique pressures and culture. So the culture and the climate that you're in really plays a huge role in whether or not people seek mental health care and support and feel comfortable doing so. So the World Health Organization recognizes burnout as a syndrome, not a disease. It doesn't meet criteria for, it's not in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, but it does meet, it is recognized as a syndrome resulting specifically from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And so there's three main components, as I mentioned before, and you got to see in the results of your own poll, that feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance or depersonalization, feelings of negativism, cynicism related to one's job, and reduced professional efficacy and accomplishment, feeling of accomplishment. So anyone doing a goal-directed activity, volunteering, students, athletes, parenting, caregiving, people work, clinicians, researchers, all of these, it can be work-related or it can be any goal-directed activity. We've now kind of expanded the view and understanding that burnout can happen in any one of these domains. And I'd like to go through some of the core components and symptoms that you might be able to notice in yourself if you're reflecting on your own experience first. So you can notice that you're feeling physically or emotionally exhausted at the end of the day, or you wake up dreading going into work. You may have reduced emotional regulation. So something that would normally be under normal circumstances, water off the duck's back, you might find really strenuous or burst into tears or just reacting a little bit more harshly to someone's criticism that was given in good faith for constructive reasons, but maybe you're reacting to it very defensively. And it seems out of touch with how you normally would react when you're in a good place. It can also result in cognitive impairment. So having memory or attention, concentration issues, things like that, you might notice you're having trouble word finding a little bit. I might be having that right now, but it's due to sleep deprivation. I happen to have a 2-month-old that is my first child. So I appreciate everyone's support of some stumbles that I might have. And in addition, sleeping problems can happen because of burnout. That can be a symptom. And there's also a lot of things with burnout that you might notice when you're interacting with others, especially at work. And so you might notice that you're more irritable when you're interacting with folks. You're not as warm and social and enjoying being around others. You may withdraw then from those social interactions and distance yourself from colleagues, from people that you work with. And in addition, interacting with others, you might notice at work, there's reduced performance. So, it might be motivation, it might be the ability to perform, or it's, just different ways. There's a lot of these things that are measurably reduced when someone meets criteria for burnout. And then inflexibility and cynicism are two other really big things that kind of come out when you're interacting with others or activities at work. So one of the things we want to emphasize, though, as a basic of burnout is that burnout is situational. And so you may be able to contain or manage symptoms. And in fact, a lot of people within academia are what we would be termed by the mental health clinicians as very high functioning. And so there's a lot of ability to cope and deal with things for an extremely long period of time, but it's something that is treatable and manageable if you engage with it. But just because your ability to manage those symptoms or contain them to just work and it doesn't spill over to affecting your personal life or your family or your friends, then that is not necessarily a reason to not seek help and not seek solutions. A common misconception that a lot of people have is that, I don't have it so bad. I don't have full-blown depression. I should just learn to live with it. And this is a really unfortunate stance to take, because you could be living a better life and be enjoying work more and being more productive and continuing to enjoy it, if you were to engage. The couple other things are that every day may be different, more days rather than not, but it doesn't have to be every single day. So we saw that there was kind of a scale of every day versus to never. And what most people responded to was around once a week. They were feeling energy burnt out, or emotionally detached, or callous about things. So burnout is not static, and it's definitely not inevitable. It's not something that you should just learn to live with, because it's something everyone is going to experience. And like we mentioned, you can be burnt out on one dimension, but not others. And we'll get a little bit into the difference between burnout and depression right at the end, in order to tease that apart a bit more. And so burnout typically is work related, and doesn't necessarily mean that you have lower energy or depersonalization or lower interest in participating in things you do enjoy outside of that work domain. So the causes are really clearly delineated now, which is great. 10 years ago, it really wasn't. And people have actually been studying burnout since around like the late 80s. So the causes are known to be chronic stress relating to work and other ongoing activities, lack of control within that work environment and over the person's activities and schedule, bullying or toxic work environments and relationships, work-life imbalance, extra job duties, but limited authority to actually make decisions around those additional job duties, and feeling disconnected from values, as well as lack of identity beyond work. So all of these things have been very clearly across many, many domains, including research, to be the causes of burnout. So unfortunately, burnout is a bit of a self-fulfilling cycle. So once you start getting into it, it can be a little daunting to get out. And this is because the causes lead to these symptoms, then the symptoms tend to worsen the situational causes at work. And lower employee satisfaction and accomplish productivity is what happens, and it gets worse and worse and worse the longer the cycle continues. We wanted to show a few employee work-related burnout data and studies that I've been doing. So one of the best is this over 12,000 respondents in a Gallup poll conducted in 2019. So this was pre-pandemic. And what they saw was that 76% of employees experience burnout on the job at least sometimes. So what is this? What's the impact? It impacts health and it impacts productivity. So people who experience burnout are 63% more likely to take a sick day, 23% more likely to visit the emergency room, half as likely to discuss with managers about their performance if they're struggling or having a hard time, and about 2.6 times as likely to be seeking another job. And what we find on the flip side is that employees who are given enough time to complete tasks and experiments or whatever it is, are 70% less likely to experience burnout. So bringing it back to a little more data about the pandemic, burnout in academics during the pandemic hasn't been studied exceedingly well as a concept itself, but there are a lot of studies that are now being done about mental health as well as stress. stress, isolation, fatigue, things that are related to burnout and help are factors in that. So the Chronicle of Higher Education recently reported that 69% of the respondents felt stressed, 68% felt fatigued, and 35% felt angry. So these could all be burnout signs and symptoms. If more than 50% said that they were very seriously considering changing their career or retiring early. And for junior scientists specifically, the crisis we know has now magnified stresses that prior to the pandemic were already present in the academic system. One of which, employee related, is that the pandemic is now resulting in a lot of career uncertainty, even more so than we had previously. So let's get to the good stuff. What actually helps with burnout? It does help to understand where it's coming from. And in fact, that is one of the critical pieces, is to evaluate what's going on. And of those causes, can you circle one of those or multiple of those and say, this is where it's really coming from? Fortunately, with burnout, as opposed to a lot of mental illnesses that meet diagnostic criteria, there's a lot of insight with burnout. You know where it's coming from. If we ask you directly, you can pinpoint it and say, it's this toxic relationship with my boss, or it's not feeling in control of my own schedule, or I work all the time, even on vacation. All of these things are things you can look at and usually with burnout be able to identify. And then what helps is addressing those. So it's really also about social support, not just that self-care component. So because it has to do with work, there are systemic issues, there's relational issues, and there's things that your boss, your employer, your entire, the institution that you're at can actively engage in to alleviate these problems for you and reduce employee burnout and then improve everybody's well-being. So taking breaks is an incredibly effective strategy, but it has to be the kind of break where, like was mentioned earlier by your executive leadership, that poor internet connection is usually a really good thing, so that you have no choice but to disengage from work and really truly take that break. Another really effective strategy that's been found for immediate implementation in order to build more breaks in is to build more breaks in and to allow for people to take a little more control over their day-to-day and what's going on. And so for every 50 minutes of work, have some kind of break for 10 minutes. And this is something that's really good to have, this 5-to-1 ratio. And so these can be breaks that are necessary, efficient, and joyful. And a variety of those throughout the day are what we highly, highly recommend. But take the necessary breaks, eat, drink, go to the restroom. Use those breaks to just get up, stop what you're doing, and go do something else, but still be efficient. Have a short list of things that are really short tasks where you can go to the printer or do something else that is helpful to your job, but is a break from what you're doing in that moment. So you're not as burnt out and you're not fixated in one place and continuing to get exhausted. And coffee with colleagues is a great way to take a joyful break, as well as what's really important is rebuilding those positive relationships at work. And so those joyful breaks, community breaks, building those kinds of interactions very intentionally is really an excellent strategy. So negotiating better working hours, accommodations, and communication at work. So if some of your stress, the burnout is coming from something where you're communicating with colleagues or communication with your boss is what's leading to that, there needs to be a mechanism in place which may teach people and encourage people to learn to listen to one another and communicate more clearly in a way that works for them. And then seeking support and better relationships at work, I already mentioned. And what's really kind of interesting about a difference between depression and burnout is that burnout really does, in fact, measurably respond to mindfulness, meditation, improved sleep, and increased exercise. So those things don't necessarily, they might help with, say, depression or anxiety, but they often don't do enough for those kinds of illnesses. Whereas burnout really does measurably across the board respond to those kinds of interventions. So some other advice that came from folks at Dragonfly were, don't internalize burnout as a failure. Burnout is a consequence of a system that expects people to work long hours and sacrifice their personal lives. This is cultural. And so addressing that culture is a really key component to fixing a burnout prone situation. And so creating ways to detach from stress, normalize conversations around mental health and that whole mental health spectrum. It's not just crisis and disease or you're perfectly fine. There's a lot of space in between involving stress and distress, and burnout is among them. And one person said to treat yourself like a tree. Every person really needs sun, water, air, nutrients, ground within which to feel supported and to grow into, and space to also grow up into as well. So those were some things from Dragonfly. And I'll just kind of recap burnout real quick. The symptoms are emotional or physical exhaustion, reduced resiliency and adaptability, cynical about work and colleagues, and reduced performance and concentration. And the causes, again, are chronic stress relating to work or other ongoing activities, lack of control, bullying or toxic work environment and relationships, and a poor work-life balance. And what works is taking breaks and vacation, negotiating better hours, accommodations, and communication, seeking support and building better relationships at work, and then mindfulness, sleep, and exercise, all evidence-based, supported by the literature. Now, in contrast, mood disorders and anxiety, so depression and bipolar depression or bipolar disorder, and anxiety are both highly comorbid and can also exist alone. They can phenocopy a little bit with burnout. So a lot of people are curious, what's the difference? How do I tell the difference? And those stats I showed you earlier showed you that there's a lot of people struggling and suffering from burnout in work environments, right? 76% of all respondents to the Gallup poll said that they experienced burnout at some point. Whereas if you look at point prevalence of the diseases of depression and anxiety, it's only about 6.7 to 6%, depending on the illness. Whereas we know that folks in postgraduate education and beyond, at least in graduate school, these rates are much, much higher. So I mentioned 6 to 8 times more likely graduate students have been found to struggle with depression, suffer from depression and anxiety than the general population. So the symptoms of mood disorders involve the mood, body and behavior, and thought disorders. And they're prevalent across the entire life of someone. So it's not work specific related, and then otherwise you're perfectly fine with friends and family and doing activities that you enjoy doing. So that's a key difference between these illnesses and burnout. And the causes are different too. So it's not work-related causes. It might be influenced by, it might be triggered by some of the things we talked about with burnout, but there's a lot more biology going on that involves the immune and endocrine system dysfunction, nutrition, sleep, or exercise deficiency. And these are extreme ones, not just you lost sleep for a night and now you're horrifically depressed. That tends not to happen. But there's also biological genetic components, trauma induction of these and predisposition to developing depression and anxiety, and serotonergic pathways themselves, which are what the main way in which we pharmacologically target these illnesses. So just to recap and to draw in a little bit more data about the difference between burnout and versus depression and anxiety, there's a few papers very recently that have concluded that there's no clear overlap between the two. So they're distinct and robust constructs. So depression and anxiety might be related, but they're not directly related. So burnout is not necessarily a clear precondition of developing depression or vice versa. But it does indicate that those at high risk, so those in highly stressful situations, such as research, are really ought to be screened for both burnout and depression and anxiety separately or at the same time in order to get them to timely and efficient treatment. So to remind you, burnout isn't a disease, but it is a recognized syndrome. So I also have included here a few things that if you type into Google burnout, MBI, CBI, or BAT, you'll probably be able to find some of these questionnaires and look at the kind of self-assess if you'd like to. Depression screeners, PHQ-9 is a good, super quick way to kind of self-assess, get a sense of maybe this is something that you're dealing with, as well as the GAD-7 for anxiety. These are all validated metrics that are being used in the research to assess the level and, and these are screeners, not diagnostic tools. So if you are concerned though, a lot of folks ask, how do I know? How do I tell the difference? And so these would be things, tools at your disposal that you might use to self-assess a little and determine if you want to go see a mental health professional in some way or your personal doctor. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm ready for the Q&A session. And I invite anybody and everybody to consider volunteering, joining us for a Dragonfly Cafe, or even donating to Dragonfly in our efforts if you like.